I don't know if I mentioned this, but a tailor has told me, it's more of a saying, but a well-made garment shouldn't need to be pressed. Just meaning that as we make, we should be pressing it before and after we use a piece. It gives the presser or us, whoever, less work when doing the final press. So obviously it was hyperbole because we're still doing a final press. Lay the back and front trouser inside to inside and line the edge of the front up to the mark-stitched edge of the back, ignoring the cilicia of the pocket. Line up the waistline, construction line, and seat line and knee line and hemline. We want to chalk the points onto the inlay so that we can see them and the front legs marks at the same time. They may not line up perfectly, but it's the most important to line up the waist lines. Everything else is secondary. Baste it in place. Baste closely to the 1 cm seam allowance, but not on it, moving the pocket bag out of the way, basting through the blind/big facing. We don't need to baste it, we can just hold them together as we machine, but it makes the sewing easier when it's basted, so it's good to do for now. We need to remember the flare we gave the bottom below the hem. If you mark stitched the way I suggested, there's the last mark stitch before it flares, but I guess we can see where we cut it as well. We can flare it out more, it's not quite clear, but I do move the bottom of the front trouser further out than the mark stitch. Machine the two together. We're likely starting from the top with one and the bottom with the other. Regardless, when you get to the border of the blind and the rest of the front trouser, it's quite bulky. So, be conscious that it'll try to push the needle away from the 1 cm seam allowance that we want. Making sure we have the 1 cm seam allowance, the pocket will end in the side seam, as all trousers should. Don't back tack at the top or the bottom. Remove the basting here and iron the machining flat. And we need to check that yes, the bottom of the pocket ends in the side seam and there aren't any raw edges showing. We should press the seam open. We basically need to iron the flares separately because it doesn't sit flat with the rest of the seam. Similar at the point that the blind meets the front. We might like to put it on a tailor's ham over the curve or a plank of wood, due to the unwieldy seam, it might take a bit of oomph to press it down flat and make it stay that way. We might also like to cut down the seam allowance so that it sits flat on either side of the pocket bag. And while you're at it, iron a 1 cm seam at the end of the pocket inlay. Especially at the bottom of the pocket with the cumbersome seams, make sure the stitch line is fully pressed open. I might do the bar tacks and prick stitching at the ends of the pockets now, such that they're hidden underneath the pocket bag, but I didn't, saving it for finishing. To attach the waistband, the first thing I want to do is to mark 3 cm and 4 cm from one edge of each waistband, making sure the marks are mirrored. 3 cm is the inlay that I put on the trouser, and the extra 1 cm is the seam allowance of the seat seam. Next, chalk the waistline onto the trouser, allowing it to curve with the top of the inlay. Same for the rise inlay as well. If you've forgotten or lost the mark stitches, I put 3 cm at the top of the waistband. On the bearer side with the zip, mark the waistline and inlay, and on the bearer we should mark it on as a downward incline, so that we can prevent or inhibit the waistband from showing over the front. We should cut the stitching down between the bearer and the cilicia to about 1 cm below the waistline, if a little more. From the 4 cm point on the waistband, measure half the waist measurement and mark that onto the waistband as well. I also want to check the length of the waistline on the trouser. From the inlay mark, we should get a measurement of half the waist plus 1 cm for the seam allowance and 2 cm for ease. The same amount extra that we had when we drafted the pattern and checked the waist measurement the first time. For some reason mine is drastically bigger than it should be, so I moved the centre back seam by 1 cm so that I have less cloth to ease in, and I should have moved the marks on the waistband having done this as well. If you remember when we drafted the trouser pattern, we measured the waistline and it was 2.5 centimeters more than the waistband. The extra cloth is going to be shrunk as we put on the waistband, which we measured between the points, which is the correct waist measurement. On the front trouser with the fly, measure the waistline from the front edge to the inlay for the same basic check. Line up the 3 cm mark on the waistband to the inlay on the inlay mark we chalked on, while lining the bias canvas edge of the waistband up to the mark stitches. Start basting it down near the heavy canvas but on the bias tape. As stated, the waistband on the trouser is a little more than we want. We will ease in the extra fabric as we baste on the waistband to the correct or finished waist measurement that we chalked onto the waistband. Depending on the material, you might need to reduce the size of the trouser as it is, like I did. We would adjust by moving the centre back, increasing the size of the dart, or even putting another dart in. We will not adjust the waist measurement at the side seam because that would change the figuration. To ease in cloth, we need to pull on the waistband, causing a small amount of rumpling in the trouser. This way, we can line the front mark on the trouser up to the second mark on the waistband, and the end result will be that the trouser has the correct waist measurement. It can be difficult to fully understand this concept, so give it a bit of thought. As you do it more and more, it will become clearer. It definitely took me several pairs of trousers and a couple of jackets before I understood. You might like to use a pin at our endpoint so that we know how much ease there is to put in along the whole trouser. Importantly, be sure to move the top of the back pocket out of the way. For the front pocket, you'll baste through the blind, but none of the silesia. Make sure the seam allowances and darts are basted down as they are supposed to sit, and basted securely so that they won't be moved by the machine. We want to put most of the extra fabric into the back and side because that's where most people need the fabric, being more flat down the front. We'll avoid basting through the fly, we want the fly to move freely. Baste it a second time if there's a lot of ease so that it's better distributed. It'll be easier to iron in and less likely to create pleats and kinks. Wet, steam and press the fabric to shrink in the trouser cloth, making it easier to machine. I'm not sure why I'm afraid of using water here. I should be getting it wet and steaming it away to shrink the cloth in. We can open up the trouser and the waistband and it'll often be clear whether there are going to be any pleats. Fasten the cloth at the zip so that the 7mm mark and the waist measurement mark on the waistband are lined up. It's important that the zip is open so that we only catch the one side in the baste in the waistband seam. Like we chalked on the bearer, we'll line up the top of the waistband to the bearer on a slight downward slope to avoid it perking upwards later. To reiterate on the fly guard, you need to unpick the silesia to below the waistband. You need half the zip out of the way, and you definitely need at least a centimetre of waistband left past the guard, which is why we added all 16 centimetres to the inlay to the waistband. That said, if it does come up short, so long as the other end goes past the seam allowance on the back, it will be okay to reduce the amount of inlay we have. To machine, we're sewing along the point that the bias tape meets the canvas, which is the same as a 1 cm seam allowance. Don't catch the canvas at all, it won't be able to fold properly if you do. When machining them, you still don't want to catch any of the silesia, hence it has to be done in 2 parts. With the bearer side, we might want to start with the centre back, while the fly side we might want to start from the centre front. We want to machine along the back onto the blind and stopping where the blind meets the main front trouser. Back tack and flip the pocket towards the back, starting exactly next to where you finished, making sure the seam allowance there is open, back tacking again, and continuing to the zip and or the center front. When sewing the right trouser, should your zip teeth go up above the waistline, slow down and maybe use your wheel to move the needle when going over the teeth. Otherwise, you may slam your needle into a solid metal nugget, which doesn't tend to go well. Proceed all the way across the bearer, folding out the seam allowance to sew slightly into it, and don't back tack at all. On the left trouser, sewing to the centre back, keeping the fly out of the way. Still no need to back tack, but if you can back tack exactly onto where the fold of the cloth is without catching the seam at all, that's ideal. Check the trousers, make sure nothing has nipped anywhere, accidentally put in any tiny pleats. Something that I think the Italians do because it traps significantly more ease, giving them greater comfort on the whole. But come on man, let's try to keep it clean. If you did get a small pleat, take out the small amount of stitching either side and try to shrink the fabric with steam and iron before replacing the stitching. If you're happy with your waistband, press the seam and take out the basting. We need to split the side seams down to the waistline stitch, because the front trousers inlay is going to be ironed up with the front pocket and the back inlay will be ironed down. And definitely split the stitch down to the waistline, not the fabric. Press the seam on the back trouser open and iron the front trousers inlay upwards. You can see all the extra fabric flaring out from the waistband like ruffling, but more subtle, and the seam being clean. Or it would be clean if I could iron it properly. If you wanted a fob pocket for your Oyster card or some such as shown in the waistband video, then yes, we would need to cut down the appropriate width of inlay in order to sew it on. To put on the side adjusters, establish where you want them. Usually the center of the buckle is in line with the side seam of the trouser. Then decide how high you want it. We can trim away any loose threads if needs be. Baste them in place. It don't need to be pretty, with the long adjuster pointing backwards and about halfway through the buckle as standard. Basically, do both tabs in the same way, but making sure that the tab holds the buckle in place. Basically do both tabs in the same way, but making sure that the tab that holds the buckle in place, the thin part, is secured under the arrow part. Once set, I'm chalking a line to follow with a prick stitch across the top so that I know on both sides where I want to stop felling. Unlatch the adjuster from the long adjuster so that you can get at it. Set the adjusters in places you like, either fell or prick stitch them in place, or both. I think felling is more common though. Make sure you make it safe and strong at the points that both sides stop being attached to the waistband, as those, I'm pretty sure, will be under the most stress. As an alternative to prick stitching normally across the tabs, we can stitch from the back, the waistband side, more of a running stitch. We stitch such that we catch the bottom of the non-showing half of the tabs. This way we don't have a line of pricks along the tab. Really, this doesn't take me that long anymore, and enough practice and technique it really won't take more than 20 minutes for the 4 of them. We can just remove the basting when we're done. Align the front leg up to the back leg's inlay. You need to line the front part again up to the mark stitches and line up the balance points. Again, they might not align properly, but it's important that we line up the seams at the seat and the front trouser up to the mark stitches. Baste them in place and machine it. You know the drill. Basically the same as the other time except simpler. Still flaring out at the bottom. Don't bother back tacking at the bottom, but do back tack at the top of the leg. Iron it flat of course, removing the basting, and iron the seam open. Ideally with a sleeve board, but a plank of wood works fine too. Flip the trouser outside out and lay it with the front trouser's center line as the fold because it's about time to iron it flat. We should already have a front crease, so make sure that it's flat and the trouser is flat to create the back crease. Start on the front and making sure the fabric is flat underneath and all the way between the front and the back that we're working on. This works best if we can place a heavy but soft weight onto the front crease to hold it flat. I would put the base of my sleeve board onto it and then something heavy on top of that. I don't have a sleeve board yet, but I'll link the ironing video of this pair, where I basically iron the crease again with my sleeve board. In my case, I hold the plank of wood onto a small section and use my iron to draw the fabric flatly towards the back of the leg. I would prefer to smooth the cloth just ahead of the iron with my hand, but my other hand is busy. Get it nice and flat up to around the bottom of the rise. If flat across the rise under the seat isn't doable, then just try to keep both legs even. Once the trouser is flat, which is much more easily said than done I think, the trouser could be shaped, but for now I'm leaving it out. Though if you want, stretch the fabric of the thigh and the calf and shrink it at the hammies and the shin. Sometime or another I'll detail this better in another video. As it stands, my trouser legs are ready to be put together.